Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
All right, good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of the Marine Corps University, Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Maj Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. All right, so today we are, it's been a long time since we've done an entirely in-house brewcast. I think the last time we did that was with when Jerry and I were interviewing each other for various things. So it's been a couple of years, so it's exciting to be able to have a chance to do this again with our internal talent. So today we have, myself and our guests will be kind of splitting the presentation and the questions here. We are joined today by Mr. Tim Barrick, who is our Wargaming Director for the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare at Marine Corps University. We had him on a couple months ago when we were talking about Force Design 2030. Some aspects we might cover here as well. But those who remember from that episode, a key piece of that was talking about some of the wargaming that went into Force Design 2030. And Colonel Barrick has continued to do the wargaming piece here as the director here, and very specific, a lot of work done on the module we're going to talk about today. So he is the lead designer for the Marine Corps' operational wargame system, which is going to be one of our two focal points today. He retired as a colonel in 2021 after 29 years of service. His last tour on active duty was as the director for the wargaming division at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab. And he's also served as commanding officer of the Marine Corps Tactics and Operations Group out in 29 Palms and as the 1st Tank Battalion commanding officer. He's a graduate of the Marine Corps War College, the Naval War College, American Military University, and U.S. Naval Academy. And those who've been following our various social media feeds as well as past episodes know that he's written several pieces recently on Force Design, but also a number on wargaming, and specifically Wargaming Ukraine, which is our focus area today. So, sir, welcome back to the show. Good to have you here. And I think this is something that each of us has sort of touched on in individual realms, but we collectively felt it was important to devote something to this because it is a rare circumstance where us as U.S. military service members have an opportunity to learn about war and conflict from somebody else in real time without us actually participating. And that is sort of the guiding philosophy behind what you and I have both done here and what we're going to talk about today. So before we get into the systems, for our audience, we have some opening remarks here, and then we'll get into it. But sir, again, welcome, and we'll turn to you for our opening shots.
Yeah, Ian, thanks for doing the spotlight on wargaming. I've been excited to do this with you, and I know you've been active a lot in the wargaming realm around here and been doing quite a bit and have your own Ukraine-focused wargaming efforts going on. So you don't get interviewed very often on the Brewcast, so it is my intent to essentially, we're co-hosting this, and I'm going to be asking you for your thoughts throughout as well. So great to just do this as a team effort on this wargaming front. There is just one point that I wanted to highlight here in terms of some of our latest wargaming activity here at the university, because we've got some exciting developments that have been in the works for about 2 years now with a wargaming cloud capability that we are in the final stages of rolling this out inside the school. This cloud is intended to enable students and faculty to be able to access digital games from any device. They can get it from home, put it on their personal computer, and access the cloud without installing the games. And from a license management, this has been one of the challenges from a PME schoolhouse standpoint of doing things like imagine assigning a war game as homework to students. Yeah. We haven't had that capability in the past, right? To be able to say, look, go install this game and play it, and we'll talk about it in seminar. That is not something we've been able to do because just getting into licenses is just complicated, right? And that's not something we've done. With the cloud, however, we will now have a library of games that are available to faculty and students to support not just Fight Club and extracurricular wargaming, but in the curriculum to be able to integrate it in so we can take advantage from a time span standpoint of wargaming, not just in the classroom, but also with assigned war games as homework that they can play individually. They can do it head to head. And what's really exciting from a Fight Club standpoint with this cloud, we are going to be running some tournaments and being able to take advantage of leaderboards. So some of the concepts and vision for wargaming talked about in like Ender's Game as an example, where you've got, you know, students of the military profession competing against each other in wargame events where they're making tactical decisions, and then with leaderboards that applies a certain competitive psychological pressure there on that, and that's going to reinforce learning, and we have that opportunity now with the cloud to do that kind of wargaming. So I'm pretty excited about it. We are going to be doing what we're calling a ribbon cutting ceremony for our cloud coming up on the 16th of September, and we're in the final stages of working through just the technical aspects of that. So I think for the community that's listening, you're going to be hearing more about our wargaming cloud capability as we go forward, because it's pretty exciting development. And I don't think there's very many folks in the world that have a capability like this that they're using from a professional military education standpoint to enable wargaming across their schools. So this year is really our proof of concept effort on this, and it's going to be a focal point for a lot of our wargaming activities. In addition to tabletop games, which I tell people I'm an equal opportunity wargamer, in that whether it's miniatures like we just did yesterday with Expeditionary Warfare School with Wings of Glory, or whether it's a traditional hex encounter tabletop game or a computer game, they all offer advantages, and we're going to be leveraging all of those over the course of this year. But that's kind of what's been spending a lot of my time trying to get that capability ramped up. And but we're here, I know, to talk specifically on Ukraine. And Ian, I know you've been doing, you've had a project you've been working on, how about we jump right in and get into that, unless there's something else you want to hit first.
Well, we'll do that. I think that we'll throw out to both our live audience here and for those listening later, something that I think is a distinction that Colonel Barrick and I have talked about here in sort of setting the scene. And it's to lay out that we're talking here about war game, and, you know, game in the title makes it seems like something that's, you know, maybe not as serious, or something done for entertainment value rather than something else. And we just want to be clear at the outset that, you know, when we're talking about wargaming, those who follow the Krulak Center or who have sort of followed the use of wargaming as a professional military training and educational tool, you know, we'll understand that the word game is only in the title because it's a descriptor, right? That has hung on it to describe it, as opposed to, you know, and that it's part of a family of synthetic modeling of something. You know, that's what a game is. You know, 9 out of 10 of them, there's certain entertainment value in there. But the point is here, we're not talking about anything that we've done here as something for entertainment value. I know from my own personal perspective, I found wargaming in general to be a tremendously valuable tool for helping decision-making, critical thinking skills, to putting you in the shoes of people who've been on different battlefields and better understanding the decisions they made. But when it came time for this specific project, you know, my personal approach to it was, you know, we're watching kind of the largest, the most bloody 21st century conflict that we've seen yet in the 2 decades the 21st century has been around. And we are not the participants in it. We are, you know, we're providing material support to one of the combatants, but otherwise we're not participants. But what do we, as the ones on the outside, what do we do with this information? You know, I could see one of 2 ways of going. You could either, you know, not talk about it, not deal with it, because you might feel like you don't have the right standing, or it might be overly sensitive to have an outsider's perspective, and, you know, try and say you have some particular insights when you're not part of it. Or I thought the other aspect was, we're at an educational institution, and as military professionals, we should be scraping every possible lesson we can out of it for the benefit of, you know, our direct students, as well as for, you know, future decision makers potentially policymakers, which I think is something you'll probably get more, sir. But the point is, if we're not trying to actively learn lessons out of it that might save us some blood and treasure and turmoil down the road, then we're not really doing our job as military professionals, and we're not doing our job as a center that is looking at future warfare, literally in our title. You know, the war in Ukraine right now, the future is now. And so we owe it to the students, the staff, and the wider Fleet Marine Force that we support to be scraping those lessons and finding different ways of presenting them and packaging them. And Wargaming, the two different platforms that we're going to talk about here today, I think that's just one way of doing it, but it's there's not a lot of other things like it that can really immerse you into, what's going on in an admittedly abstracted synthetic sense, but get you into the problem set and get you thinking about it and grappling with it in a granular fashion. So that was sort of my approach, sir. What was yours?
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. You make some great points there, and I think that one of the key things behind these game efforts, I think one, as you mentioned, is the value to military education. I think one of the questions that as we war game conflicts like this, that we have to ask ourselves, because I think we're also wargaming it as an investigation into the current state of warfare and what is important and how the outcome is determined. What is the current state of combined arms? Has it evolved from the last conflict, right? And these are important questions. There's also risk when you use one conflict like this. I think one of the lenses you have to put on it, or a question, is what we're seeing the new normal for combat, or is it specifically unique to this specific conflict because of the combatants that are involved and all of the cultural, political, and then the capabilities of those forces, the characteristics of those forces? Is what we're seeing in how the conflict is unfolding unique to Ukraine and this Russian conflict, or are we seeing a new combined arms warfare, right? I think these are one of those questions that those of us that are observing this are asking ourselves, and as military professionals, it's a responsibility to be asking these questions, because as military is looking to being prepared to engage in any future conflict and being prepared for it, you can't ignore what's happening in the world around us, right? You have, and this has been done historically through multiple conflicts where there's international observers who are seeing what's happening and asking these questions. Is this unique? And there's examples from history where people did not learn, right? And then they enter the next war, and then you look at the Russo-Japanese War and what that taught us about trench warfare, machine guns, and the lethality of that. And then those lessons that were in the Russo-Japanese War then had to be relearned by the Western powers in Europe with World War I, right? Because they didn't take note enough of the changing character of war. And so that's one of those key questions that that when we war game it, we are deeply immersed in analyzing that conflict from a game design standpoint, from playing it, wrestling with what factors matter to the outcome. And so there's value there from an investigative kind of sense. And then I want to hit on the policy making point. How do we, as in our case, American citizens, want our senior leaders making decisions? Do we want them winging it from a decision standpoint? Do we want them going off of gut instinct? Or do we want them making decisions that are informed by some kind of analysis? And if you have a war going on and you're wrestling with a policy decision, it would seem to me that you would want to inject the courses of action that you're wrestling with into some kind of war game framework to try to think through what is going to be the impact, and at least have some degree of subject matter expert adjudication that is going to wrestle with that policy decision, say, this is what we think the impact is going to be. What is the potential response of an adversary? And then what would be our counter, right? And there's a great podcast, it's a gaming podcast where their title, it's a great title. It's called 3 Moves Ahead. And that's kind of one of these things. Don't you want our decision makers thinking 3 moves ahead? And how do you do that, right? Because it's hard for us to grasp what is the next move and what is going to be his move to my move, and then what's the move to that, right? unless you sit down in a game and deliberately kind of plot those out and what if those circumstances, you can't possibly make an informed decision in the complexity environment. So I think war game tools allow current decision makers, if they have it available, right? If they have a war game available that can war game the problem that they're wrestling with from a policy standpoint, then they can use that game to help inform those decisions. And I think, certainly this game has contributed to that. To what degree, I'm not exactly sure, but I would say that I do know that some of the results from the gaming we've done have been submitted and helped inform senior leaders. And I would like to think that that was value added to their decision process. So I think there's a lot baked into that in terms of the why behind gaming, but it's absolutely not just as a hobby. It's not just because it's entertainment. And it is as professionals to contribute to military decision-making, national level decision-making. War games add value, and they help prevent loss of life, wasted effort, and informing optimal courses of action. So that's the why behind why war game capabilities that we have on the shelf that can be used to help enlighten the way forward on contemporary conflicts add value.
So I think with that, we're now to our audience, we're going to transition over and start getting into these two different game systems that we've been developing and adjusting over the last few months.
All right, Ian, I know you've been putting a lot of effort into this. Can you talk about what this game is that is on the table and kind of some of an overview of the game, and then maybe we can get in a little bit into some of your design choices on this and some of the things you've been learning in doing it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, sir. So to our audience, if this in general looks sort of familiar to you, if you've been following the Krulak Center, honestly, for about the last 2 years now, then you'll know why it looks familiar. It's because this is based off of the Fleet Marine Force / Littoral Commander gaming system that was developed by Sebastian Bay and a team of his out of Georgetown University and the Georgetown University Wargaming Society that they put together there. So, I'm not going to rehash the whole history of it, but the game itself was initially developed as a prototype by Sebastian's team, and the original focus was on the South China Sea, potential U.S. operations against a potential Chinese adversary in about the year 2030 to 2035. So it was forward focused. It included potential future technologies that we didn't have integrated yet, but as part of Force Design 2030 for the U.S. side, we said that we were going to have. So that was sort of the core game design. The main mechanic was completing the kill chain. So in doing that, all of your units would start hidden on the battlefield with the assumption that in the 21st century, it'd be very hard to hide that something was there. But what that something was and exactly where it was inside a piece of terrain is still hard. And so it takes time and effort to complete that kill chain. So you would deploy your units hidden, you would complete the kill chain using ISR or other methods to find your adversary's targets. You would decide if you wanted to prosecute that target or not, and then you would continue to do that to go after your scenario objectives unique to it. Talking about scenarios, the really useful thing about this game system was its adaptability, its customizability, if you will. So the initial slate of scenarios was focused on Luzon between a pre-made Chinese-U.S. order of battle and a slate of cards that captured a lot of the future capabilities in the realms of fires, maneuver, C5 ISR, information, and air defense and missile defense that might come online. So in the game use, we expanded the slate of scenarios to different regions around the world, different maps, and could make new cards for new capabilities that came in there. And it was great because if the U.S. or China or somebody else fielded something, 6 months after the game was designed, you don't have to break the game to make something new. You just make a new card, boom, it's in there, right? Unless it's a completely new unit or order of battle, it was very easy to adjust and tailor inside of the rules framework that existed. So when I'll call it the fall of 2021, when the Russian buildup on the border of Ukraine started looking more and more serious, like it might be something more than just saber rattling. Inside the Krulak Center, I sort of came to the decision we need to be potentially ready on the small but non-zero chance that this turns into something larger. So we actually asked to get a map of Eastern Ukraine made for this system, and that was when we went down to TMF to do the wargaming demonstration for them. We had asked the contact who did map design for OWS if they could just like shoot out a map for Ukraine. Like if it was easy for them to do it, it'd be fantastic. If they couldn't do it, got it. It was a last minute request, but they did. They cranked out a map of Eastern Ukraine within the Littoral Commander game framework. And we took it down there. It didn't have anything more than a map, but we wanted to kind of show TMF that this is your area of interest and responsibility. We at the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, we're thinking about this, right? We know this is your 24/7, but we're thinking about this too. And if you need something more, we have a starting point. And it kind of sat for a couple months after that, but then 2022, the buildup hadn't stopped. The buildup had gotten more. So I took there was an existing Russian platoon size order of battle that Sebastian had generated for some of those other maps I talked about, other scenarios. Took that, I created a rudimentary Ukrainian platoon size order of battle, and we put it on this map of Eastern Ukraine. Just to,
When you say platoon size, you mean that the counters are at the platoon level?
Yeah, the counter size. So again, those who've seen this before know, but each of the blocks in the traditional Littoral Commander game is one platoon. One platoon, and the map sizes are very large because the game was made to talk about distributed operations at a smaller unit level, because that's what Force Design 2030, that's what the Marine Littoral Regiment was supposed to be about. Distributed, covering a large area with a smaller footprint, hard to target, but still mobile and lethal within those smaller sizes. So that was sort of the starting point for the prototype Ukraine scenario. And as we play tested it, and I'll note Lieutenant Colonel Kobeck, he helped with this when he was back with us at the center, rapidly came to see that for this type of conflict, that scale was not going to work. And some of the game map itself, the scale was not going to work, because initially built for distributed small units over a wide area, that is not how we got a sense this conflict was going to go, because you're talking about now much larger mass formations. Russia and Ukraine are both large conventional armies. They're not looking to disperse, or the way the MLR is, disperse, stay hidden and provide fires and sensors and other things for a larger naval campaign. They will require mass. They will require large concentrations of troops and equipment to achieve each of their respective objectives in the offense and defense. So, and also we determined with that, the hexes just weren't big enough to capture the formations. Like we were stacking platoons and platoons in these small hexes, and it wasn't working from a gameplay standpoint. Wasn't usable. So I took that and I went up from platoon to company size to try and capture the larger scale without going too far outside of the scope of the game, because it's essentially a tactical game. But also, I turned back to Sebastian and his civilian map designer who made some of these expansion maps, and I said, I need the same scale for the mechanics, but the hex has got to be bigger. Like they just literally need to be bigger so that we can effectively do more massed troop concentrations. And I didn't really know, we're getting into February 2022. I didn't really know what I needed, but I was like, 2 good starting points might be focusing on southern Ukraine, Odessa, major port down there, the Crimean area, Sea of Azov, that, we know that if Russia wants total control of Crimea, they're going to want that coast along the Sea of Azov. So if you can give me that terrain, because that's a maybe, right? And then give me a zoom in on Kyiv, because there's a big concentration in Belarus of troops, and it's, they're probably going to try and come down there as a potential operation. And so February 19th is when I started the design process with this designer to generate these. He generated them within days. It was really fantastic. And then come February 24th, the invasion's actually on. So that really lit a fire under me. We're like, I've got the pieces now. We have to start developing scenarios and mechanics. And that's when the living design process for this really took place. So as the initial weeks of the war unfolded, at first I was taking my Kyiv map and throwing these things down. These were not mirrored exactly on units that were out there, because we didn't have a lot of information, but it was brigade size. So 3 brigades versus 3 brigades, Russia versus Ukraine. And then when that
that impulse stopped and then went back when the Russians were not successful in doing that. I shifted down to the map that you see here and started looking at potential amphibious options because there seemed to be Russians had great success initially down here, and if they could lock out Odessa, that was sort of what we would call the most dangerous course of action that the enemy or the adversary could do. So I threw together a little amphibious scenario for that one.
Can you speak to what in your mind, as you've been designing this and playing it, what are those features of the game that you feel are consistent with what we're seeing unfold, that you're kind of happy you either whether it was baked in early or whether you've adapted it? What are those features of the game that you think kind of support modeling Ukraine? And then what are those features that you think might be deficiencies that you feel like you need to work on in order to better replicate what's going on over there?
Yeah, so I think the core of the game, it was still helpful, and in fact, having a lot of the game built into the cards was great because it made it very easy to rapidly put new things in as we started learning stuff on the battlefield. I think the basics of concealment versus using different forms of ISR to complete that kill chain, that's what the core game was built on, and I think that has manifested itself very, very strongly on the Ukrainian battlefield. So that stuff was already in there. That was great, as well as the impact of long-range fires for both sides. And in fact, I would say that core piece works a lot better even now than it was for my initial build, because initially I had the Ukrainians really without much long-range fires at all, mostly artillery and maybe some relatively short-range rockets. But as it happened, Sebastian built the core game with Marines with HIMARS. Well, now the Ukrainians have HIMARS, so this actually works out very well from a game design standpoint. The thing that has required the most change and adaptation was really in two areas. One was the critical importance of logistics, especially if you do it badly, which we saw in the push. We saw everywhere, but in the push to Kyiv, that really was manifested because the Russians did it badly. I would say today they continue to mass their logistics in places that are easily destroyed by precision weapons. But in terms of like sustaining that push on Kyiv, we saw lots of videos of vehicles that weren't destroyed; they just ran out of gas, right? Or you had Russian soldiers with out-of-date MREs, those field-ready rations that we would call them, lack of gasoline, lack of munitions. So the core game for Littoral Commander had a logistics element, but it was really focused on resupplying your fires and your combat expenditures, right? Your bullets, your missiles. So what I added was a sustainment logistics function, so that now every time you move, there was a separate logistics category that was consumable that you would have to resupply. And
that's just an aggregate representing all classes of supply.
Yeah, it's your food and your gas, and it's the stuff that you need to move from point A to point B over time. So now there's a new, there was already a logistics layer. I just kind of copied that and made it one when you move instead of when you shoot, to create new logistics challenge for both players, but especially for the Russian player, because their logistics is, again, they mass it and they don't protect it.
And in the game system, one of the things I've been wrestling with in the operational wargame system is being able to target that logistics. For example, the HIMARS strikes we're seeing on ammunition depots. How do you feel the game is doing that? Is that something you're going to have to work on improving, like positioning of ammunition depots that are potentially targeted, or do you see that as something that you're abstracting from a game design standpoint?
So I haven't made anything specific for those larger ammunition dumps. But the Russians, when I built out the company size orders of battle, I gave them all the same type of logistics support companies that they had in the original platoon size, in which the core game already has. Really what I've done is I haven't made anything new for the Russians, but as the war has unfolded, I have given more things to the Ukrainian order of battle and Ukrainian cards that allow them to go after those. So for example, the use of irregular and soft forces. When I do this next week, when we do this for an actual training iteration for a fleet unit, I'm going to give the Ukrainian side a lot more soft and irregulars to reveal, to identify where those things are, and then strike them and really create that logistics problem for the Russian player. So I say that was it's a new layer that makes the movement a little more finicky, but that was relatively easy to do because there was already a logistics layer. I just made 2 logistics layers now instead of the one. The really big thing that has been ongoing has not been the kinetic fight, but representing the human layer on the battlefield, which I think this is not knocking one game system or another, but a lot of our PME-based wargaming, we act as if the people aren't there on the battlefield. And we saw in the early days of this war and continue to see today, the people are there. They are impacted by both sides. You have to account for them, and they have to be part of your problem because they are potential targets. They are potential impacts to your operations in terms of mobility, where you can and can't do. In terms of what you can't do, for example, I'm sure the Ukrainians are thinking now they're conducting counteroffensive to the Kherson region here, right? They're about to go into urban terrain, which is a tough fight already, but it's their people. Like we saw when the Russians went into cities, they don't care. They will blow up everything and kill everybody. They do not care at all about the civilian impact. The Ukrainians will, because that's their city and their people. What is that going to do to how they frame that particular part of the operation? So to have this layer, we got some really great input from several visitors who came down, who work more on the NGO, the non-military side, but recommended things to put in there. So this is where most of the expansions actually happen in terms of creating that. So things that have been added have been increasing the impact of shooting into urban terrain. In the core game, for example, if you shoot into urban terrain, you would take a hit on the influence meter, which is this thing down here. And the influence meter had, for a lot of the scenarios, it's an abstracted aggregate of like global regional opinion, if you will. Are you good on the influence meter, or are you negative? And that would have some small impacts on how the game would progress. So I took the influence meter and I really firewalled it to the point of like, any further, we're going to break the game. But I thought it was important to represent. The human impact is one of those areas. So shooting into urban areas is no longer just kind of like a minor penalty, right? Every time you do it, it's going to accrue as a much more major penalty, which is going to impact your regional global perception of your forces. But also it breaks stuff. It breaks civilian infrastructure, which is going to create an internally displaced person's problem, right? Because if you kill all the water and destroy the food and the electricity, if the people can get out of that situation, they're going to do that, right? And they're going to continue to try and do that as long as they're not able to live in that environment. So you shoot into a city now, you destroy civilian infrastructure, that generates internally displaced persons on the map consistently, unless you conduct specific actions to fix that infrastructure and try and get it back online. What do those internally displaced persons do now on the battlefield? Well, they move, right? They're going to move into the places you might want to move to. They are a cumulative impact on your mobility moving through the space that they occupy, which is going to impact where you can and can't go. But they're not just they're not like a non-player character, if you will, on the battlefield. You can do things about that will again impact regional global perception. So I had a mechanic where you can now use your own supplies to conduct humanitarian aid. You can give away your things that would otherwise let you move, give them away to rectify their situation, to give them some supplies, which would not disperse them, but sort of move them in a way that no longer impacts your mobility, right? Which is good for you from an operational standpoint, but also it gets you influence and gains you that public perception. And I added several other things that go after influence, but another thing we've seen in this war is the information space and the concrete power that global opinion can have on the battlefield. I thought needed to be manifested a lot more. So the influence meter no longer goes to 10. It can go up pretty much as far as you take actions that gain you or lose you influence. And in the core game, at certain stages, you might get like an extra action point to do an extra action, or you might get some extra command points, which are the things you use to get the cards here. You can now stack and accrue that to a much higher extent in this particular scenario. Which I felt reflected accurately, like the the more positive side, if you're on the plus side of the influence, if you're Ukraine, for example, that has gotten them concrete stuff, right? So if you conduct humanitarian aid, that's a good thing. That gets you more influence, which is going to make people want to send in more aid to help with that situation. And you can also, what else can you do? Handling of enemy prisoners of war, same thing, gets you influence because you're following the rules of war. You have to. If you're going into an urban area and you take care in what you're doing, if you don't just fire long range, if you conduct more deliberate, precise ground attacks where you can direct your fires with a little more precision, you assume some more risk, but that also gains you influence. So how this is played out is that Ukraine is almost always on the plus side of this. It's gotten them a lot more cards. It gets them more supplies. It gets them things that they can use. And I think that was a lot of extra stuff to add, but it's mirrored reality, right? Like they're getting stuff for the information.
Shows that dependency on the external support.
Yeah, and on
Which is certainly a hot topic these days of, question of as this unfolds and goes further, how long is that external support going to be maintained and sustained as part of the conflict? And then if that does go away, what happens to Ukraine? So, I mean, I think, that's a great mechanic to bake in to kind of measure that. Can you speak to some of the game components? And for those of you who are maybe listening in a podcast, what you see on the map is your standard war game hex encounter map with some block counters that are company size representing the units and formations. But Ian, you've got a few things sprinkled on the map that if you wouldn't mind kind of talking about the game components between the front lines, there's a bunch of black blocks that are kind of spread through there. And then kind of in the Russian rear areas, there's some clearly Ukrainian assets that you've portrayed in various components. Can you speak to those?
Yeah, so I'll start with the rear areas first because that was part of the core game, and I've added a little bit to it. So in the core game, you had the chance to use SOF, and I'm holding up one of the little green meeples to represent SOF. What that does for you is it's extra ISR and intel in the hex that it's at. So, for example, revealing location of logistics dumps, air defenses, long range fires. Usually, unless you've done some sort of ISR in the game, you have to get to the hex adjacent to have your sort of organic reconnaissance reveal what is out there. Well, if you drop SOF back there, now you can see more deeply behind the enemy's lines. And now that they have HIMARS, they can reach out and touch that a lot more effectively. The little green, the hex boxes here, these were also part of the core game. They were represented as proxy forces. And a lot of the scenarios didn't include the proxy forces. And so sort of not a lot of mechanical development was done with them. But I thought that in conflict, this is pretty important because potentially every Ukrainian back here is a proxy force, is an irregular, that at a minimum could provide some sort of intelligence about movements, locations of things like that. So I took the proxy mechanic. I gave the Ukrainian side a lot of them, and I've added some additional mechanics as well for what the proxy forces can do. So proxy forces can in place hasty obstacles. They can still do their ISR piece. They can actually attempt to get damaged Russian units to surrender. I still need to test this out a little bit, but as you knock down the hell points of the Russian units, I've given the Ukrainian side the chance to try and use their degradation to get them to quit. So the more you knock them down, the easier it is for them to surrender, actually. Basic die roll, but it's an easier die roll the more damaged that unit is. But your proxy forces have that option to do that too. So now you can start potentially getting more units away from the front line being a problem on the battlefield. So that was already in there. The black cubes here are, I added an obstacle emplacement mechanic. And so that's something that the proxies can now do. They can emplace obstacles. But I'm also going to have the regular units be able to emplace obstacles as one of the actions that they can take. So the reason it's all sort of saturated up here is my expectation is that the Russians have had time to dig in, especially getting warnings, indications that a counteroffensive might coming. You know, there's outside of the color coding of the terrain in terms of its mobility, ease or difficulty in moving through it. There wasn't really another option to sort of reflect digging in deliberately. So I added this mechanic where you can choose, instead of fighting or doing resupply, you can dig in and you can add to your defensive value. So it's directional. So you have to build in on sort of choose the hex side and add to it, but it's cumulative. So if you want to spend a few turns really digging in, you will get an extra defensive value when your enemy tries to cross that particular hex side. Which I think reflects what's probably going on in this region right now. And then I forgot to put them on the map here, but those IDPs, they are little yellow cubes that go around the battlefield as well. So they are a thing on the battlefield you have to deal with now. The last thing I'll note, which is something I've been tinkering with for several scenarios, and again, for those out in the audio only, I'm holding up one of it looks like a normal joint capability card, but how to gamify your national strategic doctrine in a way that does something on the battlefield. So the core game didn't have this. I started tinkering with this, I think, first for the Norwegians and Marines, where the Norwegians have a national defense concept called the total defense concept. And when I read through it, it's like all of the nation is at war, right? They're not necessarily putting on a uniform, but all of your national resources and assets in some way are going to support the war effort. Whether that's civilians providing intelligence from where they're at, using their smartphones, or, diverting civilian delivery men to, from delivering FedEx packages to delivering, supplies up to the front line. It's a whole of society mobilization. Ukraine had a similar concept called comprehensive defense. Not as much detail available from English language sources, but it struck me as the same thing. So I'm like, okay, how do we gamify their national defense concept to reflect that all of nation is in on this, all aspects of the nation, civilian, military, are supporting it. So I tried to turn it into a card that the Ukrainians start with, and it gives them extra benefits each turn to reflect the fact that they're fighting on their home territory. So what it does is every turn it generates for you free ISR for locating Russian units. It generates free supply base because your whole nation is supplying your forces. It generates, you get additional actions that you can take because it's your home territory. You know it well, right? Everybody's going to be helping you try and conduct action. So it will reflect on a greater tempo, a bit more freedom to do things because everybody's on your side there, basically, in that country. And then also increases your ability to influence this. Again, that you're fighting in your home country, that's a powerful strategic narrative in itself. And I wanted something to gamify to reflect that would be a persistent impact. So I made a card to try and do all that stuff to gamify their defensive doctrine and strategy. So I think that kind of covers the other components that are out here.
So this is, some of you may be familiar with the operational wargame system. This is a game system that was originally developed inside the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, particularly at a level of warfare to explore warfighting concepts and roles and missions of the Marine Corps within a joint campaign. But of course, such a war game, if you're fighting a joint campaign and you're looking at all domain operations, it's not only useful for informing future force development, but it can also be used for multiple purposes, particularly to include professional military education. And as I talked about earlier, current leader decision-making, planning, et cetera. It can, with a map and with an order of battle, it creates the opportunity to have the right kind of discussions and enable adjudication of interaction that a war game provides. When I used to be a G5 planner in Marine Corps Forces Europe and Africa a number of years back, I wished that we had a game tool like this that we could put on the table. We did not. And so that was one of the things when I became the wargaming director at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab. I really sought to deliver a tool that could be on the shelf. So if there was a crisis or contingency, you could put something on the table and actually war game it. And so that has been now about a 4-year process of taking what began as a Western Pacific game and building expansions for the European theater that include Baltics, Poland, Norway, and the North Atlantic, and Taiwan, and Southeast Asia. We've got a global variant to this. The Middle East is in the works, looking to get that completed in the next 6 to 10 months. But Ukraine was one that, personally for me, always been very interested professionally in the ongoing conflict ever since 2014. And it was in that window that I was a planner in Europe. And so had a lot of interest in watching this unfold and in engaging what is the relevance and impact on not only the Marine Corps, but on the United States and on NATO as we look at going forward. And then, of course, for the Ukrainians themselves. So this had been on my radar as a expansion to the operational wargame system that I wanted to deliver at some point. And then when the Russians were ramping up in December and January, it became evident that if I was ever going to get this expansion out, the time was now. And so in January, really went into overdrive to produce the order of battle, and simultaneously had Pete at Marine Corps Intelligence Activity that was helping while he was making the map for this. And that started a multi-week process for him in refining the map as I was working on the orders of battle for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the separatist forces, which you see in the different shade of red over in the Donetsk region. So that's the genesis of the game, and the first beta test finished on, I believe it was about February 18th, so literally about 1 week in advance of the invasion by Russia. We finished the first beta test, and that beta test wargamed a Russian invasion, and it was a multi-axis invasion plan. I give credit to those that were involved in that original beta test. My brother Nate Barrick, who's a strategist with Special Operations Command, and we had some Canadian allies that were participating. David Redpath, and then Dr. Jorg Muth from Baltic Defense College, and we had a number of other players, Dr. Jim Lacey from here at the school, all involved in that initial beta test in wargaming various aspects of the plan, and Lieutenant Colonel Kobek was part of that as well. That was focused particularly on the rules, to try to get the rules for the ground system refined, and believe me, there's a lot of debate about various aspects of this game and the ground system. And that's one of the key topics I really wanted to talk about here was, clearly what you see is this is an operational level game covering the whole of the country. The counters are at the battalion level. What Ian showcased was one at the company level. This goes to battalion, and each of these counters is a maneuver battalion or a fires battalion or air defense. But what I want to talk about is some of the learning that I've had over playing this and designing it, and what, in observing the conflict unfold, were some of the deficiencies in the original design of the game that now I think must evolve for this game to better model the conflict. And then also some of those things that we saw that were consistent, right? There are some strengths in the system. I would say one of the first things to note is the size of the forces involved. The orders of battle matter greatly, and these orange symboled counters for the Ukrainians represent National Guard, territorial defense units, reserves, and what quickly became evident for the Ukrainian order of battle was a couple of key early decisions. One is mobilization and the need to augment their forces if they're going to cover all the front lines with all those forces. So one of the things that really stands out to me in designing this and playing this is the role of those reserve territorial defense formations in helping really beef up an order of battle. And that from a national defense plan standpoint, those kinds of forces matter a lot in their design and in their readiness. And granted, none of those are going to be fully ready because they are part-time. But when it comes time for a national fight, they are essential to the overall force generation of the force. And that's been a key piece that's been apparent to me, because as we've applied attrition to the fight, it's been evident that the Ukrainians have been able to maintain their front lines because they have that depth in their formations. If they only had their active force and they suffered the attrition that they've had, they would be really thin and would not be able to maintain this fight. So that's been one of the key things I've learned from this. The other piece is force generation. So typically when we play this game, when you lose a unit, it's off the map. And the only regeneration that we had baked into the rules really on a consistent basis was dealing with aviation capabilities to regenerate until those get fully eliminated. But for ground units, one of the things that I've got to better refine in the system is it's pretty clear that in a protracted conflict like this, the question of force generation is a crucial one. And we're going to observe this with Ukraine as they conduct this counteroffensive and go forward is, do they hit a culminating point because they don't have sufficient forces built up to sustain an offensive, right? That's one of the crucial questions for both sides is, do you have enough combat power to achieve your objectives, to sustain an offensive? And then if you do hit a culminating point, how long does it take you to regenerate that combat power? And that's a campaigning question, and it's a design question from a game standpoint. And there are commercial games that do have these kind of features, but it's evident to me that in the OWS game system, what is lacking right now is that force generation model that allows you to take ground units and then regenerate and put them back. We've got some house rules. There's some various folks, some of the Army guys that have been working on this, like Kurt Hudson, some really good concepts leveraging commercial game techniques such as remnants, force remnants that you can use to then put back in the battle space. We also have in the game taking some of those lost forces and using them to contribute to generating partisan forces. So we have some features, but I think in particular, like we've seen this third corps that the Russians have now delivered to the battle space somewhere in Ukraine. It's that kind of formation, right? That the original game for this did not fully account for. And so that's one of the things I'm wrestling with is that force generation, getting either units rebuilt and that same organization put back in the fight. Because are they truly eliminated? I mean, one of the things I was thinking about is if we were in a war like this and a Marine battalion suffered huge casualties to the point where it was rendered combat ineffective, it's not gone forever, right?
Yeah.
We're going to rebuild it. We're going to pull it back off the lines. We're going to focus on regeneration, and we're going to send it back in the fight at some point. And again, there's great games. I know Mark Semenich with his World War II series has this kind of rebuilding units, put them back in the fight. But right now, that's missing in this game system of a formal rule to do that. So that's one of them. The other thing that I think I would be remiss not to talk about, it goes back to logistics. And you talked about it with your game. We've had lots of conversations about logistics, mechanics in the game. The current mechanics really focus on a supply unit that is projecting supply about two of these yellow hexes here, which are 100 kilometers across. So a division has a supply unit that's projecting combat service support over about a 200-kilometer radius. And if you extend beyond that radius from that supply unit, then your combat gets demoted and your ability to fight gets degraded, right? So what's evident here as you look at the map is if the Russians move their forward logistics units into Ukraine in order to project power like all the way to Kyiv or to Dnipro or to Odessa, they have to expose those logistics units to being inside of Ukraine. And if they keep those in Russia, they can only project it like so far in. I think that's been pretty consistent. I think that kind of logistics mechanic has worked. But what has not worked on the logistics is the original game design from an initiative standpoint. You could activate all the divisions and fight with every unit. And what we're talking about now is a mechanic that constrains that. So you have to devote some kind of resource to activating a division to be able to put it into the fight in an offensive manner, that forces you to concentrate on operations in like one area of the fight.
Yeah.
And to build up those resources to conduct an offensive. And you will have to have an economy of force effort elsewhere on the map. There's great commercial game systems that do this. The operational combat system for World War II, you have to actually build and distribute ammunition and fuel counters and stockpiles on the map to sustain an offensive. So wrestling with that, because one of the features we don't want to do is then completely immobilize units that are not in the direct fight, that they can't do anything. So there's like a sustained consumption of ammo for day-to-day operations that allow you to defend in place. And then there's a increased state of supply and readiness that allow you to conduct an offensive. And one of the features deals with artillery. In this game, the artillery counters have multiple essentially fire missions on them. And up until now, you could fire all those missions in every turn, right? And that's clearly not a reality. And so what we're looking at is if an artillery unit has 2 fire missions, just as an example, if they're not resourced, they're only able to fire one of those fire missions in any given turn as a sustained rate of fire. And then if they're in an offensive mode and they're well supplied, they can actually fire their full allocation of fires and contribute that to the fight. The other piece is attrition, how quickly units suffer losses. In the game system, you can actually suffer losses in this game very rapidly.
Yeah,
And
definitely seeing that.
and so that's clearly not borne out by the realities of some of the resiliency. And this is one of those questions of, okay, we're just not seeing the casualties. Like those casualties are occurring, but they're regenerating and resupplying and sustaining those forces. And reinforcing them with more replacements coming in, or are the Russians really not pressing the attack to the degree that either they or the Ukrainians are reaching a breaking point, right? And is it really, are they really more demonstrations of assaults, or are they fully committed when they're making these? And so what is the rate of loss? What is realistic, and is what we're seeing unfold, how does that translate in terms of overall attrition, and how do you model that in the game? So that's something, looking at how quickly units die and by what method, right? So those are some of the key things that I think clearly the will to fight, the cohesion, the Ukrainians have an advantage, obviously. And so how does that get manifested in the game system? That's another one I've been wrestling with, is should the Russian forces, just be, the game system has a promotion, demotion mechanic that enables you to apply those kinds of modifiers. So do you just say, hey, every Russian unit is demoted once right from the get-go, and that's just sustained because of that human factor? I don't know. That's something I've been wrestling with in terms of the design. Aviation operations, when we played our beta test, the Ukrainian Air Force was wiped out in the first couple of days, right? And that clearly is not borne out, but at the same time, how effective are they, right? So a lot of times when you remove a counter from a game, it's not that counter was destroyed 100%. That counter was rendered combat ineffective to where it's no longer relevant to the fight. So this is one of the questions that I'd have about the Ukrainian Air Force is, okay, they're obviously still operating to a degree. What is the effect operationally of that Air Force and in its operations, and then also tactically? And is it significant enough that it does warrant being represented on the map with counters and actually rolling some dice to achieve effects? Those are things that I think are key questions. was that that strike that occurred in Crimea, on that airfield, was that
Yeah.
coming from air or something else? So that's clearly, if that was coming from air, that was clearly giving an effect, right? Which should be represented in the game.
Yeah, and I think the aviation specifically is an interesting question, and it's I was listening to a different podcast this morning, War on the Rocks. I'll give them a little shout out, but they had talked to Michael Kaufman, who's their sort of go-to Russian expert, and he was talking about that uncertainty about the impact of Ukrainian aviation, because they have only shown on video what they really want you to see, which is not necessarily reflective of what they're doing. So, I've seen videos of, jets and helicopters flying like super treetop low level. You get some videos of rockets popping up and, maybe some motivational soundtracks, but that's just what they want to know. And I'm sure there's very strong operational security reasons for not showing more. Yeah, the point is a lot of uncertainty. We know that they still exist, that they're still in the fight, but what they're doing, whether they're responsible for things blowing up in Crimea or if they're responsible for other things and we're just not seeing them because they're not advertising them.
Yeah.
Open question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think it's important before we kind of transition to perhaps some questions here. I want to give a shout out. One of the key pieces to this that's vital in war game design is order of battle. And, in putting this together, trying to reconcile orders of battle for Ukrainian forces, which by and large has been based on what's on sources like Wikipedia or in other reports that are out there. And then same thing on the Russian side with reports that come out of think tanks and studies. The Russians have been changing their order of battle in the last few years pretty dramatically. I mean, we see new divisions rolling out like just about every year. There's been, in the last 2-3 years, there's been a new division headquarters established. And even on the eve of this fight, they established the 47th Guards Tank Division that when I first published the game was not present in the game box, and then went back and clearly that was evident that they had this new division headquarters, and so I had to go back and convert those units and change it as a supplement. And then I was not able to physically fit in the game box because I went down to battalion level all of the order of battle for Russia. And so that's one where now that the conflict has been unfolding, we're seeing some of those units that I don't have counters for in the game. And I'm working on a supplement to now reconcile what the order of battle was that's in the game with the order of battle that we're seeing. So I give credit to guys like Jomini of the West on Twitter, has some phenomenal maps with some great open source order of battle. That has been a contributor to, force laydowns and to informing what I've got. And then most recently had a guy up in Canada, Cole Peterson, give a shout out to him, did some phenomenal research to help reconcile what's in the game with what we're seeing unfold and what are the deficiencies in the order of battle that I need to make up with a supplement. So as we go forward, some of the things that I'm working on with this game to enhance it and make it more accurate and relevant are some of the things I talked about with logistics, with command and control constraints that force decisions to concentrate operations and control tempo, and then also order of battle updates so that there can be a more accurate representation of the order of battle on the map. So this is getting a lot of interest, obviously, and a lot of different operational headquarters that are using, I think, similar kind of war room battle board like this, and then also wargaming this for multiple purposes. But yeah, I hope to continue to support the ongoing decision making that is needed with game tools like this, not only for Ukraine but for other conflict areas, particularly like Western Pacific, to help inform decisions. So,
I did have one more question for you, sir, about something that is very hard to model, and I don't have a good answer for it in the Littoral Commander scenario. But I know you've run lots of iterations of this as well with a lot of very smart people in the room. But the challenge is there is, let's call it Russian military judgment, right? And I think it's fair to say we have seen Russian military judgment from sort of the tactical, like the squad platoon level, up to large formation deployments, not doing things that we would do, not doing things that seem tactically sound or make tactical sense, not having some of the lower to mid-level, leadership or initiative or training to drive a difficult attack home, right? In the face of very strong opposition. And I recall from sort of anecdotally from one of these iterations here, where we actually had our friend Dr. Yuval Weber here, who I just talked to today, and there's a new episode with him coming out. So if you haven't listened to it yet, listen to it. But he was making some decisions on the game map here that I think on the U.S. side seems sort of nonsensical to them. Like, we would never do that, right? But the challenge has been we would never do is not always what they're actually doing. They are doing things we would not do. And that seems to reflect a decision making, a military judgment / political influence dynamic that has been hard to capture. I'm just curious, that was one iteration, but in the other iterations you've done, has there been a way to get the Russian players to think that way, to do those things that seem somewhat nonsensical to us, but they're doing it for their own reasons? We just don't necessarily get it. How is that manifested or not manifested?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you're hitting on a central aspect of wargaming, that wargaming done right, your opposing force players are finding that in the same thinking process and decision process that the real world players in that country would be using that, right? That's a tall order, because if you're asking somebody that, is American and grew up in America, has years and years of US military education and training, to then step in the shoes and be a Russian player, there's going to be a degree of mirror imaging, right? Where that person is going to make those decisions based on their individual professional judgment. That can be flawed, right? That is a risk when you war game. And so there's always a desire to have subject matter experts that can get more inside the mind of the adversary and understand what their decision process is, and then how they're applying that in the battle space. And I would say with the Russians here, a couple things. One, you have the decision making at the national level with Putin, right? And how that decision process unfolds, and he's clearly central to the whole process. And his objectives and his decisions of what is he demanding of the military, right? And then that they deliver from an objective standpoint. That is clearly imposing a dynamic from a Putin strategy and Putin's objectives. And, and I think there's been a lot of, great analyst dialogue discussing what that is, right? But then you have the tactical decision making that is inside the Russian military now. When you start talking about at the headquarters level, how are they fighting this? What kind of tactics? What is the operational art that they're applying to it? So when they get this task from higher up, how is that applied then operationally and tactically from a military decision-making standpoint? And are they practicing sound decision-making? What is their way of war, right? That those Russian generals are waging, and is there a logic there that they understand and that makes perfect sense to them and that we may not be seeing, right? So I think there's a danger in being a critic when we have partial information of saying, hey, these Russians are being stupid here, here, and here. When if we had the information that they had and understood the full context, we may better understand the military logic, right? I'm not going to defend them at all from politically what they're trying to do, but from a military art, like given a certain task, how do you achieve that task? And how do you apply military force to achieve that task? They have constraints on the tools at their disposal. With the forces and the degree of training, clearly a lot of reliance on forces that may not be very well trained. They have equipment constraints. So how do they fight and how they wage that conflict? And how does that translate to operations on the ground? I'll give you another example. Think about a headquarters targeting process, right? building a collections plan as a headquarters to then support a strike campaign to go out there and hit targets. So from just observing, it would seem like the tempo of the Russian operations is not as high as we would expect, like we would do from a strike campaign or an air campaign. It hasn't been there. And so they have conducted a lot of strikes, but what is their tempo as a headquarters? What is their targeting process? What is their collections process? How long does it take them if they're going to do dynamic targeting? How long is their dynamic targeting process? At the brigade level, at the battalion level, and then when you go up to like the division and combined arms army level, at each echelon, what does that look like? And as a military with a doctrine that very heavily relies on fires, I would suspect that at the lower tactical levels, they probably have a pretty good degree of proficiency. And then when they get to the higher levels and the more operational strikes, I don't know. I really question just how proficient are they at that level of synchronizing the surveillance, reconnaissance, and collections effort with their fires capabilities and developing a dynamic fires campaign. Those kinds of questions then translate when you talk about a war game. What are we modeling in the tempo of operations, right? Because ideally, when you're doing a war game like this, you want to try to model what the Russians are doing, play it the way the Russians would do it, and then see what is the effect and the impact. And if we make improper assumptions on their command and control and give them a greater degree of credit on their tempo of operations from a command and control standpoint that they can generate, then we're going to have a flawed outcome. And so that's why with games, you always have to, in the end, say, look, this was a game.
Yeah.
There are going to be flaws in the model, flaws in some of our assumptions. And so then you have to constantly go back and second guess those and examine those and say, did we get that right? And if you find that, for example, this tempo question, if this is crucial to whether the operations are going to be successful or not, and you find that, look, if they can achieve this tempo, they'll be successful. If they don't achieve this, they're not, then you really need to dive further into that and examine it more closely. I think when it comes to this conflict, the force generation question is the one that's central. The ability for Ukraine to generate and regenerate forces to sustain a degree of combat power, and the ability of the Russians to generate. And if they're both at the same level, then what we'll see is a continual attrition until one side is bled enough that they say, look, no more, I'm ready to quit. Or one side gains enough of an advantage from a combat power standpoint because their force generation has been more proficient and efficient to deliver more combat power, that from a relative combat power standpoint, they're able to gain enough advantage that they can achieve their objectives. I doubt that either side is going to have, this is just Tim Barrick's opinion, is going to be able to force generate to the degree that they can achieve a decisive outcome here. And they will bleed for a long time. So that is the danger and concern. But when you war game it and you look at the combat power that's there, neither side, I think, is going to have an easy opportunity here to really gain a significant enough advantage to achieve decisive effects. So hopefully we can see some outcomes from Ukraine, particularly their offensive here, where they can achieve some, at least within the southern region, some decisive effects, and we'll see how that plays out in the long run.
Yeah, that last point, I think we'll kind of end on that because it's a good point. We don't have any other questions here, but that actually ties into something that Dr. Weber has been mentioning for months now in terms of what is going to be the decisive thing that does it. And it's not necessarily the forces we see here on the map, but he's compared it as what runs out first. Western will and ability to provide external support to Ukraine, or the Russian economy being able to limp along long enough to keep the war going. And those are the things outside of the specific military force generation concerns that could be where that decisive action happens.
Yeah.
Right? Not necessarily for what we're seeing on the battlefield, because whichever one of those fails first is going to have that ripple effect potentially downstream on the battlefield. And we don't know yet. I know as it seems right now, Russian economy has limped along sort of better than we thought it would, although it's not doing great. U-Haul keeps track of like the things they're running out of on any given day of the week, and the list is only getting longer. On the flip side, the European countries and the United States seem to indicate they're going to provide their support for the foreseeable future. So that becomes that long-term game. Which one runs out first, the Western support or the Russian economy's ability to keep the wheels on?
Yeah.
So, and again, we don't know. All right, so I think we'll end it there. No more questions. Sir, it's great to have a chance to. We have talked about wargaming at the Krulak Center, and we have talked about the war in Ukraine, but we have not done something like this where we've highlighted what we at the center have done to offer to not just Marine Corps University, but as well to those fleet units and, as you said, other allied headquarters partners who are out there. So I think the last note I'll end on is you should have gotten the message that these tools, they are tools not for us, they are tools for others. They are here at Marine Corps University at the Krulak Center to be used for those who look at it and think there could be some value that they're going to gain out of it, and whether it's looking at policies or tactical decisions on the battlefield, or simply getting outside of readings and slides out of the classroom and getting into a more dynamic, granular environment where you can really put yourself in as close as you can into the shoes of the people who are there and look at the resources they have and the decisions they make and try and get something out of that. So these are here for you out there in the virtual world. Let us know. We're easy to get a hold of if it's something that you would like to come in and take a look at Marine Corps University, or if it's something you would like a little trip up the road to do. We've done both and can certainly do it in the future.
And I look forward to our next brewcast on wargaming.
Yes, there will be more. They're coming. All right, sir. Thanks for your time.
Great to be here.
Great discussion. And to our Brewcast audience, I hit on Dr. Weber. There's a new Down the Rabbit Hole episode out if you haven't listened to it already. And we have a very busy September schedule shaping up for the Brewcast. We have some more great opportunities with some senior Marine Corps leaders. We're going to be talking about some of the things, the changes going on in the Marine Corps that we've hit on before, so that's going to continue. And then we're also going to have some more opportunities for our non-resident fellows as we get into academic year 23, bring them back on and give you a sense of what they bring to the table, what they are as a resource to those here at Marine Corps University, as well as around the fleet. So make sure you're following us on social media or on our email distribution for those updates, because September is going to be busy. It's going to be good. We'll see you then.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.